The night had no sound, only the soft hum of electricity beneath old walls and the faint creak of something unseen shifting above the ceiling. Outside, snow fell like ash, swallowing the shape of the mountains until they disappeared entirely. The cabin looked small against the dark tree line, its windows glowing a pale yellow that felt too warm for how cold the world truly was. It should have been a place of peace, a shelter after a long journey. Instead, the light looked like an eye, unblinking and watchful, waiting for someone to enter so it could finally close. People who rent cabins online often say the same thing afterward. It looked different in the photos. Some mean the lighting, others mean the angles, but every so often, someone means something else entirely, something they cannot quite describe. They say the air felt heavy the moment they stepped inside. They say the silence had a pulse. They say they felt watched even when every window was covered. The man who booked this cabin was tired of the city. He wanted silence, space to breathe, a place untouched by noise and people. The reviews mentioned solitude, a scenic view, and a kind host who left homemade bread on the table before each guest's arrival. The photos showed a simple wooden home framed by tall pines and a winding path that disappeared into fog. Nothing about it looked dangerous. Nothing about it looked alive. Yet when he opened the door that first night, the smell of damp wood and iron filled his lungs, and for a moment, he thought someone had just exhaled beside him. He stood still, his breath frosting in the air, his reflection trembling in the small glass pane near the door. The lights flickered once and steadied as if acknowledging him. There was no one else inside, but the floorboards carried weight, a faint rhythm, soft as footsteps, echoing from the hallway that led to the single bedroom. Later, when investigators walked through that same door, they said something strange. They said the dust patterns near the table were wrong. 2 plates had been set, not one. 2 cups had been used, though only one set of footprints led to the cabin. The host claimed he had left only one set as requested. No one could explain why the second place looked recently touched, or why the chair opposite his had been pulled out just slightly, facing his seat. He had told his sister in a voice message that everything felt too still. He laughed afterward, but his voice carried a tremor. "There are no birds here," he said. "Not one sound outside. It is like the world stops after sunset." The message ended with the faint noise of wind against the cabin walls and something softer, like fabric dragging across wood. That was the last time anyone heard his voice. The police found his car parked neatly outside 3 days later. The bread left on the counter had grown hard, untouched. His bag was still unpacked. His phone lay near the bed, its screen shattered as though crushed in a trembling hand. The front door was locked from the inside. Locals avoided the place long before it appeared online. They called it the house that eats time. Decades ago, it had belonged to a family who built it from the timber around them, sealing their walls with sap and prayer. They lived quietly until winter took them. No one knew exactly how. The furniture had been sold, the walls repainted, but some things do not wash away. The forest remembers. The walls remember. And sometimes when night falls and the last guest leaves, memory wakes again. In the booking records, each guest who stayed longer than 2 nights mentioned dreams, faces behind glass, whispers in foreign tongues, footsteps circling their bed. One woman left in the middle of the night, driving barefoot through the snow. She said she had seen her own reflection move before she did. Another man claimed he woke to see a figure standing in the doorway, wearing his own coat. None of them could prove anything. The property kept earning 5-star reviews, posted by accounts that never existed before or after their single comment. The man's case was different. The security camera outside had been installed just weeks earlier, meant to record wildlife. It captured only fragments. At 2:43 a.m., the cabin's light flickered violently. For 1 second, a shape appeared in the window, a tall silhouette bent at the neck as though leaning close to look out. But the guest was inside at that time, asleep in bed. The outline moved, then disappeared. The light went out completely for 13 minutes before returning on its own. In those 13 minutes, something happened. The police noted the time carefully. No sign of forced entry, no prints but his own, and no clear explanation for what occurred inside that locked room. What remains are fragments, the sound of footsteps on audio logs, faint breathing through thin walls, a reflection on glass. The air in that place never felt right. Even days later, officers who entered said they felt disoriented, as though gravity bent slightly differently inside. One said his watch stopped working as soon as he crossed the doorway. Another said he thought he heard someone whisper his name. He never returned to finish his report. They closed the file after a few months. Officially, it remains unsolved. But locals still see the light come on some nights, long after the property listing vanished. Some say it means the owner is cleaning. Others say it means another guest arrived. The forest swallows everything eventually. Sound, shape, memory. What happened inside that cabin is a matter of record, though no one can make sense of it. A man went there for peace and silence. He found it in a way. Silence deeper than sleep, peace without breath. They say you can still see a faint handprint on the frosted window beside the door, though it fades when you look directly at it. And when you turn away, when you think it is gone, you may feel the air move behind you, like someone standing very close waiting for you to look again. Tell me, if you booked a quiet stay deep in the woods, would you open the door if the light was already on? He had chosen the cabin for a reason that felt harmless at first. The city had drained him and the noise of living had become unbearable. He worked with numbers, deadlines, and machines that hummed without pause. His apartment looked out over traffic that never slept. Every evening he found himself staring at the same cracked ceiling, hearing echoes of things that were not there. When he saw the listing for a secluded cabin surrounded by silence and shadow, he felt a pull he could not explain. The photo looked peaceful. Snow resting on the roof, pines stretching like guardians, a small porch light glowing faintly against the dark. The caption beneath it said, "Perfect for those who need to disappear for a while." It stood on the edge of a forgotten town, where the road narrowed until only one car could pass. Locals called the area Hollow Creek, though the creek had long since dried. It was the kind of place that could vanish from maps and no one would notice. Only the old bridge at the entrance still carried a nameplate, rusted and unreadable. The air felt thicker there, heavier somehow, like sound moved slower through it. The nearest neighbor lived almost 2 miles away, across a stretch of dead forest that had never recovered from a fire decades earlier. He arrived late, just as the last light faded behind the hills. The host had sent a message. "The key is under the mat. Bread and candles on the table. Heat takes a few minutes to settle." It was polite but oddly distant, written as if copied from a script. There was no welcome, no warmth in the words, only instruction. He thought nothing of it. He had no intention of meeting anyone. He wanted isolation. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. Dust motes swam in the glow of his flashlight. The furniture was simple: wooden chairs, a narrow table, and an old cast-iron stove with a kettle still resting on top. The air held a stillness that felt ancient, like the walls remembered every breath ever taken there. He noticed small carvings etched into the beams near the ceiling, tiny symbols that looked burned rather than cut, their edges darkened as if branded by heat. He brushed his fingers across one. The surface was warm. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe the previous owner had been superstitious. Maybe the symbols were meant for protection, like old runes carved to ward off bad weather. He unpacked his bag, lit one of the candles, and opened his laptop to check for service. There was none. Even the clock on the screen flickered for a moment before freezing. The first night passed quietly. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the glass, and the world outside was swallowed by darkness. But sometime after midnight, a faint sound stirred him awake, a dragging noise, slow and rhythmic, moving across the floorboards of the main room. He waited, his pulse steady but sharp. The noise stopped as suddenly as it began. When he rose to check, there was nothing. Only the candle half burned and the door to the porch slightly open, though he was certain he had locked it. Morning brought no clarity. The forest looked calm, too calm. No birds called, no branches shifted. Even his own voice sounded muted when he tried to speak aloud, like the air absorbed his words. He ate in silence, convincing himself exhaustion could make the mind see things that were not there. He had read once that isolation could play tricks on perception, especially in winter. The human brain, starved of external noise, begins to create its own. That idea comforted him, at least for a while. Later that day, he explored the area around the cabin. Behind it stood an old tool shed, half collapsed and covered in moss. Inside, he found rusted nails, an oil lantern, and a faded photograph pinned to the wall. It showed a family, 2 adults, a child, and a dog, standing in front of what looked like the same cabin, though the trees in the background were smaller, younger. The date on the back was smudged, but one word was still legible: winter. He pocketed it without thinking, a small curiosity to study later. When he returned to the cabin that evening, the air inside felt wrong. It smelled faintly of metal, sharp and cold. The candle he had left on the table was extinguished, though he did not remember blowing it out. The photograph he had placed near his laptop was missing. He searched his pockets again, certain he had carried it back. It was gone. The space where it had rested left a faint imprint, as though something damp had touched the wood. That night he dreamed of the family in the photograph. They stood outside the cabin motionless, faces blurred by frost. The child's hand pressed against the window, leaving a fogged outline that pulsed faintly with light. When he woke, his heart was racing. He found condensation on the same window, a faint handprint fading slowly as morning light seeped through. He began to question himself then, not out of fear, but confusion. He was rational, measured. He did not believe in ghosts or curses, yet the cabin felt different each hour, as though it breathed with him, inhaling when he exhaled. The sound of footsteps came and went, always too soft to follow. The bread on the table grew stale overnight, though he had sealed it tightly. Sometimes he caught a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, but when he turned, there was only empty air and the faint creak of settling wood. He sent one last message before the signal died completely. "Everything is fine, but the nights are strange here. I hear things. Maybe it is just the house adjusting to the cold." He ended it with a laugh emoji, trying to make it sound lighthearted. The message never delivered. In Hollow Creek, stories had circulated for years about that cabin. The locals avoided it not out of superstition, but memory. The family who built it had never left. During the blizzard of 1973, a search party found the mother and child frozen beside the well behind the shed. The father was never found. Some said he had gone mad, hearing voices that led him into the woods. Others said he had been inside the cabin all along, beneath the floorboards, sealed away to keep something worse from escaping. The new owner never lived there. He simply listed it online. Guests came, stayed, and left quickly, most leaving vague reviews about unusual atmosphere or odd noises. But one review, posted anonymously and later deleted, had said something else. "Do not stay here." The cabin remembers. By the time he arrived, the warning had vanished from the site. The world had a way of erasing what it could not explain, but the forest had not forgotten, and the walls, marked by symbols burned into the grain, were waiting for another story to claim. By the third night, the cabin had begun to change shape. The walls felt closer. The ceiling seemed lower. He could not tell if the cabin was shrinking or if his mind was expanding into spaces it was not meant to enter. Every sound carried a strange rhythm, like breathing muffled beneath the floorboards. The fire refused to stay lit for long, dying with a hiss as though something invisible exhaled on the flame. He started to keep the flashlight near his bed, though he could not explain why. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering his footprints each morning as if the world refused to acknowledge his presence. The forest beyond the window never moved, but sometimes he caught glimmers between the trees, pale reflections that vanished when he looked directly at them. Once, while refilling the kettle, he noticed condensation forming on the glass despite the heat inside. The shape was almost human, pressed against the pane from the outside. When he stepped forward, the mark dissolved, leaving only frost. He began keeping notes in a small leather journal, the way a scientist might track an experiment. Day 3, one entry read, "Sound of dragging again, like something heavy being moved. Checked all rooms, nothing there. Window left open slightly even though I closed it before bed. Bread now gone completely stale." Another note followed hours later. "Dream of water running under the house. Smell of iron stronger tonight. Sleep came only in fragments." He dreamed of the family again, their faces blurred, standing at the edge of the forest. The child's eyes glowed faintly as though reflecting firelight. In the dream they whispered without moving their mouths, and the words echoed inside his skull. "You should not have touched it." When he woke, the carved symbol on the beam above his bed was darker, the edges raw as if freshly burned. He spent the morning convincing himself it was coincidence. The human mind could create patterns out of nothing, especially in isolation. Perhaps the marks were reacting to the smoke from the fire. Perhaps the dreams were shaped by the photograph he had found. Yet deep down another thought pressed against his logic. What if the cabin was aware of him? What if it was listening? The temperature dropped again that evening. His breath misted even with the fire roaring. He tried to distract himself with a book, but each time he glanced at the clock, the hands had not moved. Hours passed in the same minute. When he tapped the glass, it cracked. That sound, sharp and sudden, made the entire room tremble. Then came the knocking. It started faintly from the direction of the shed. 3 soft knocks evenly spaced. He stood by the window, staring into the darkness, waiting for a figure to appear. Nothing did. The sound came again, closer now, echoing from the wall behind him. He turned. The wall was solid. No door, no loose boards. Only wood, ancient, cold, and breathing faintly with the rhythm of the wind. He wanted to leave, but the snow outside had grown too deep. His car was buried, the road invisible. He thought of walking to the nearest town, but the idea of entering the forest at night filled him with an animal kind of dread. The trees seemed to lean toward the cabin, their branches skeletal against the faint light of the stars. When he returned to the main room, the candle had gone out. Yet the air shimmered faintly like heat rising from stone. His reflection in the window no longer matched his movement. It blinked a moment later than he did, as if lagging behind. He whispered to test it. "Who are you?" The reflection's mouth stayed still. Then, after a breath too long to bear, it smiled. He stumbled back, knocking over the chair, and the room plunged into complete darkness. The sound that followed was wet and soft, something dragging itself across wood. He fumbled for the flashlight and swept the beam across the floor. Nothing. The door was closed, but the key he had left in the lock was gone. The next morning, he found it lying on the table beside the bread. Someone or something had placed it there carefully. The second chair, which had remained empty since his arrival, was now pulled out again, angled toward him as though waiting for him to sit. A thin line of ash circled both chairs, forming a rough boundary. He did not cross it. His journal entries became more erratic. Words slanted across the page, letters scratched too hard. Something is moving inside the walls. I hear breathing when I close my eyes. The smell, it is stronger now, like rust and rot. The handwriting shifted near the end, hurried and uneven. I think the cabin dreams when I sleep. That afternoon, he climbed into the attic hoping to find a logical cause, a loose pipe, an animal, anything that could explain the sounds. The attic was smaller than expected, barely tall enough to stand. Dust covered everything except a small patch near the center where wood shone clean, as if something heavy had rested there recently. He found more carvings burned into the beams, each one slightly different from the others, each pulsing faintly with warmth. When he descended, evening had already come, though he could swear only minutes had passed. The fire had died again. The window he had sealed shut earlier was open wide, letting in a slow stream of cold air. On the glass, faint words appeared in the condensation, letters forming shakily one after another. Stay. He stood frozen, watching the word fade. The silence after was worse than any sound. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. He wanted to leave. Every instinct in him screamed to run. But curiosity, that small, cruel impulse that leads people toward what they fear most, kept him there. He lit another candle, sat across from the empty chair, and whispered into the stillness, "What are you?" For a long moment, nothing answered. Then a faint creak came from the floor beneath him, followed by another. The table shifted slightly. The candle flame bent forward, as if pulled toward an invisible presence. He did not sleep that night. He could not. The sound of breathing never stopped. Sometimes it came from the wall, sometimes from just behind his ear. The forest outside whispered against the glass like fingertips tracing his name. By dawn, something inside him had changed. The cabin was no longer just wood and air. It was alive, patient, and aware of his fear. It wanted him to stay. It had been waiting for someone to listen. The morning after the word appeared on the window, the air inside the cabin carried an impossible stillness, the kind that presses into the lungs until breathing becomes deliberate. He sat at the table, staring at the faint circle of ash that surrounded the 2 chairs. He had not crossed it since the night before. It looked different now, thicker, darker, as if new lines had been drawn during the night. Something in that detail bothered him. The ash did not scatter when he blew on it. It clung together, almost oily, as though bound by something unseen. He wanted to rationalize it. The mind seeks order even when faced with chaos. Maybe the fireplace had been disturbed by a draft. Maybe his exhaustion was shaping delusion into pattern. Yet there was one truth that logic could not bend. Someone or something had been inside while he slept. When he finally checked the camera mounted near the porch, the footage had corrupted. The screen displayed only static and a low hum, steady and unnerving as if the machine itself had recorded silence. But when he adjusted the brightness, faint shapes moved across the static. Shadows pacing the front door, not quite human, their outlines bending as if submerged underwater. For exactly 13 minutes, the footage remained active, then cut out entirely. The timestamp read the same as the one from earlier police records, the night he had vanished. He noted everything carefully, as if writing the facts might hold back the unreality. The footprints near the porch were wrong. They were not pressed into the snow, but rather lifted, as though the ground had formed around something that never truly touched it. The distance between each mark was uneven, stretching too far to belong to a single stride. It was not animal. It was not human. Inside the cabin, more details emerged as daylight touched the walls. The carvings, once subtle and burned into the beams, had deepened overnight. Their edges glistened faintly as if wet. He ran a finger over one of them and pulled back sharply. His skin burned, not from heat but from cold, the kind that feels alive, like frostbite beginning to think. He began reading about local folklore on the documents he had downloaded earlier, the ones that had seemed harmless when he first arrived. One name appeared again and again, the listener. Descriptions varied, but all spoke of something bound to silence, a thing that mimics the sound of the living, waiting for those who isolate themselves in its reach. The more a person listens, the more it learns their voice, their breath, their rhythm, and once it knows them fully, it no longer needs to hide. He thought of the reflection in the window that had smiled a heartbeat too late. He thought of the breathing behind him in the dark. In his journal, the entries turned erratic. The walls are not hollow. They speak when the wind stops. Another. I found hair between the boards. Not mine, long, dark, still damp. And then, scrawled near the edge of the page, it wants me to talk. He searched for proof. He lifted the rug and found faint symbols carved into the floor, aligned with the ones on the ceiling. A ring of markings, incomplete near one corner as though interrupted long ago. Beneath the missing section, the wood was newer, a repair that did not match the rest of the cabin. When he pried at the edges, the board came loose easily. The smell that escaped was foul, heavy with decay. Inside the narrow gap beneath the floor, he found what appeared to be a small wooden box, sealed with wax. He lifted it out carefully, his hands trembling. The box was covered in the same burnt symbols, and its surface was slick with moisture that should not have been there. He felt a pulse beneath his fingers, faint but rhythmic, like a heartbeat wrapped in wood. For a long moment, he simply stared. The air grew colder and the candle flickered violently. Then, against every instinct of self-preservation, he broke the seal. The sound that followed was not a sound at all. It was absence. The entire cabin seemed to inhale and hold its breath. He saw a shadow ripple across the walls, sliding like ink underwater. The flame of the candle bent sideways and every window in the cabin fogged at once. Something had been released, something that had waited beneath the floor longer than he could imagine. When he looked inside the box, there was nothing visible, only a hollow darkness that seemed to swallow light. Yet from that void came the faintest whisper, a sound shaped like his own voice. It repeated his name once, calm and deliberate. He dropped the box immediately, but the whisper did not stop. It came from every direction now, the walls, the ceiling, the cold space beneath his feet. He fled outside into the snow, gasping, desperate for distance. The air cut through his lungs like glass. The forest looked different now. The trees were not standing still. They leaned inward, their trunks subtly curved, creating the shape of a circle around the cabin. It was as if the woods themselves had bent to contain what lived there. He realized then that the symbols were not meant to protect the house from something outside. They were meant to keep something in. And when he broke the seal, he had undone what generations had kept buried. He returned to the cabin out of some misguided hope that closing the box would restore balance. The air inside had changed. The furniture seemed rearranged, the shadows moving independent of the light. His reflection no longer appeared in the window. Instead, a second figure stood beside where it should have been, slightly behind as though waiting for him to notice. In the center of the table, the box now sat closed again. The wax seal had returned, freshly melted. He had not touched it. His journal ended abruptly after that. The last entry contained only one sentence written in neat, careful script. I understand now why they never left. When investigators arrived days later, they found the cabin empty. The table was set for two. A small camera lay broken beside the chair. The footage recovered from its memory card captured only silence. Yet faintly beneath that silence, a voice whispered his name once, his exact tone, his exact rhythm, and then the static swallowed everything. No one could explain the patterns burned into the beams or the faint ring of ash that never dispersed. They said the cabin was structurally sound, though those who entered reported hearing low breathing when they stood still too long. The box was never found. By the time the investigators reached the property, the air around the cabin had already changed. Locals said the forest had grown quieter in the days following his disappearance, as if the trees themselves refused to speak of what they had witnessed. When officers first stepped inside, they described a pressure behind their eyes, a subtle distortion in their sense of direction. One said it felt like walking into a dream that did not belong to him. The first few minutes of the search were routine, checking for signs of forced entry, calling his name, photographing the space, but then the silence began to pull at them. It was not the ordinary kind of silence. It had weight, vibration, and the faint rhythm of breath. One officer thought he heard a heartbeat echoing faintly through the walls. Another said she could smell something sweet and metallic like rust mixed with burned sugar. They both ignored it at first. They told themselves grief and exhaustion often made the senses unreliable. The table in the center of the cabin still held two plates. One of them had food on it, bread torn in half as though shared mid-meal. The other plate was empty but dusted with crumbs, faint as fingerprints. The chairs faced each other perfectly, positioned too precisely to be random. Whoever or whatever had sat there had done so with intention. As the investigators continued their work, one of them found the journal. Its pages were stiff with dampness, the ink smeared in places but legible enough to piece together fragments of his descent. The early entries were steady and rational, but the later ones trembled with obsession. Words slanted into confusion, letters carved deep as if written under duress. I hear them whisper my name through the fire. The symbols have begun to move when I sleep. The air has a heartbeat. One page stood out more than the rest. In neat handwriting, unlike the frantic scrawl that filled the final pages, a message read, "If you hear breathing when you are alone, it is already too late to leave." That line stayed with one of the officers long after he left the property. He could not sleep the following nights. His dreams replayed the sound of the forest wind, though he could swear it whispered back to him. Within a week, he requested transfer to another precinct. His report remained unfinished. The host of the Airbnb, a man in his late 50s, refused to meet investigators face-to-face. He communicated only through email, citing health issues. When questioned about the cabin's past, he admitted that his family had owned the land for generations. His father had built the house over something old. He did not elaborate. When asked what he meant, he wrote, "The land remembers more than people do. That place was never meant for guests." His tone in the messages carried no guilt, only resignation. It was as though he had accepted the cabin as part of a larger curse that could not be undone. One detective believed he knew exactly what had happened, that he had been waiting for someone else to go there, to keep whatever lived beneath the floor fed with attention and presence. Others dismissed it as coincidence, a delusion shared by men who spent too much time in isolation. But there was one undeniable truth. Everyone who entered that house left changed. One of the forensic technicians stopped showing up for work a few weeks later. His colleagues found him sitting in his car outside the station one night, engine running, eyes fixed forward. When asked what he was doing, he said he was listening. "You cannot hear it?" he whispered. "It follows the quiet. It waits until everything stops." He never returned to duty. The evidence from the cabin remained inconclusive. The fingerprints matched only the missing man's. No traces of another person were found. No animal tracks, no tool marks, nothing. But the camera recovered from the attic contained a final frame burned into its corrupted data. An image of the main room, the two chairs visible, and behind one of them, a faint outline of a figure, Its face was turned toward the lens, though where eyes should have been was only darkness. Psychologists who studied the case later spoke about collective atmospheric trauma, a phenomenon that occurs when places absorb emotional residue from violent or fearful events. They said the cabin had become a psychological echo, amplifying its visitors' deepest anxieties until it broke them. But others, those who went there and felt it themselves, said there was nothing psychological about it. The fear had presence. It looked back when you stared too long. The sister of the missing man visited the site months later, escorted by authorities. She stood in the doorway for less than a minute before turning away, tears streaking her face. When asked what she felt, she struggled to answer. Finally, she said, "It felt like he was still there, but not in a way that could ever leave." That statement became part of the final report, but it never made it to the public release. The file was classified after a journalist attempted to publish an article about the listener of Hollow Creek. The journalist later retracted her work, claiming she had experienced unexplainable sounds while transcribing her notes. The case fell into silence again, but the emotional aftermath never did. People in nearby towns claimed to dream of the cabin without ever seeing it. They described the same details: the flickering candlelight, the circle of ash, the whisper that repeated their name until they woke shaking. Some dismissed it as urban legend, but others swore the dreams began after the investigation ended, as though something had spread quietly from the forest outward. Even those who never stepped near Hollow Creek began to feel the weight of its story. The house had become more than a place. It had become an idea. The idea that silence itself could consume you, that a space built for rest could become an instrument of memory, that loneliness might invite something ancient to sit beside you and learn the rhythm of your breath. And once it learns that rhythm, it does not forget. When the official investigation ended, 3 conflicting theories emerged. Each one tried to explain what had happened inside that cabin, yet none could silence the unease that followed every name attached to the case. The first theory was clinical. The second was criminal. The third was something else, something that refused to stay contained within the language of reports and psychology. The clinical theory began with the mind. Experts claimed that isolation in extreme environments could distort time, perception, even sound itself. They called it environmental auditory hallucination, a defense mechanism against loneliness. According to this explanation, the missing man's experience was not supernatural but self-inflicted. The silence of the mountains created echoes where none existed, reshaping his own thoughts into voices that seemed foreign. The carvings in the walls, the ash circles, the sense of being watched, each symptom aligned neatly with cases of sensory deprivation psychosis. It was a comforting theory for those who needed order. But it began to unravel when the evidence refused to obey logic. The recovered camera footage contained not one, but 2 distinct breathing patterns, one belonging to him and one deeper, slower, positioned behind the microphone. The waveform data showed overlapping frequencies, impossible for a single person to produce simultaneously. The technicians verified the equipment was functioning correctly. That alone fractured the first theory. The second theory was darker. It suggested human involvement, a local intruder perhaps, or someone with access to the property. Investigators revisited the host's records, cross-referencing payment logs and correspondence. What they found raised more questions. Several earlier guests had filed private complaints to the booking site, claiming they felt uncomfortable during their stay. One message read, "I heard footsteps above me when there was no second floor." Another said, "I woke to find my clothes folded neatly on the chair beside my bed. I had not left them that way." None of those guests had pressed charges. The host refunded them quietly and deleted the listings each time, only to re-upload them under a new name. When police questioned him again, the host admitted he had never once entered the cabin after it was built by his father. He claimed the place did not welcome him, but his story contradicted itself. Bank statements showed he had purchased supplies for upkeep, candles, wood sealant, new locks. "I send others to do the work," he said. Yet no contractor in the nearby towns had ever received such a request. When asked why he kept listing the property, his answer was chillingly calm. "It asks for visitors. It does not like to be empty for long." The criminal theory might have held if not for the physical impossibilities. The locked door, The sealed windows, the absence of additional footprints in or out. Whatever presence had been in that house did not enter. It had always been there. And so the third theory emerged, whispered first among locals, then in online forums, until it became the shadow beneath every rational explanation: the listener. The folklore went back generations before the house had ever been built. In the late 1800s, before Hollow Creek even had a name, settlers avoided the valley entirely. They said it was cursed. That sound did not behave normally there. Travelers who camped in those woods reported hearing their own voices repeating from deep within the trees. Hunters described hearing their names whispered just before their fires went out. Some claimed to see figures that mirrored their movements a second too late, as if reality were running on a delay. The oldest story spoke of something that learned through imitation, something that grew stronger each time it was acknowledged. It was said to live in silence, feeding on attention and emotion. When people spoke of it, they invited it closer. When they listened too long, it learned their voices. Once it knew them, it could follow anywhere sound could. One anthropologist studying local legends called it a memory parasite. He believed the listener was not a spirit but an echo, something created when trauma became sound trapped in space. Every scream, every prayer, every whispered name in fear leaves an imprint, he wrote. If a place collects enough of them, it begins to listen back. The theory gained quiet traction after an audio engineer examined the corrupted recordings recovered from the cabin. When the static was filtered, layers of sound emerged beneath the noise, voices overlapping in dissonant harmony. Some were clear enough to identify. They included not only the missing man's voice, but fragments matching the tone of guests from previous years, and one faint sample that matched an archived radio broadcast from 1973. That was the same year the original family was found dead in the snow. No one could explain how. Decades-old frequencies had embedded themselves into a modern digital file. The engineer resigned from the case after analyzing the final seconds of the clip, claiming he heard himself whispering his own name through the static. From that point, official interest declined. The case file was sealed, labeled under Unresolved Anomalous Incident. But for locals, the legend had reawakened. People stopped renting cabins in the area. Travelers driving through Hollow Creek reported interference on their radios, a distortion that resembled heavy breathing. Some said it followed them for miles before fading. Months later, a hiker passing through the region found the missing man's journal pages scattered near the riverbank miles from the cabin. They were soaked through, ink melted into veins of blue and black, but one phrase remained legible. It followed the sound of my heartbeat. Those words reopened the discussion online. Forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries dissected the evidence, posting slowed versions of the recordings. Many who listened reported hearing faint repetitions of their own breathing in the background, as if the audio responded to whoever played it. The clips were eventually removed, not by moderators but by the hosting sites themselves, after users claimed their devices began to malfunction, screens flickering, microphones turning on by themselves. To this day, Hollow Creek remains uninhabited. The Airbnb listing no longer exists, yet travelers occasionally find duplicates of it on obscure websites. The photos slightly distorted, the cabin angle reversed, the windows showing reflections of people who were never there. When users attempt to book it, the page reloads endlessly, looping back to the start. Some believe the listing is bait, a digital echo replicating itself through the network, waiting for new eyes to find it. Others say the house itself has learned the language of the living world and uses it to call for guests once more, and if that is true, if the listener still waits behind those silent walls, then every story told about it is another knock at its door. Every retelling feeds its memory, gives it shape, teaches it another voice to mimic. Even now, somewhere in that valley, a window glows faintly against the dark, and inside, two chairs sit facing each other, one empty, one waiting. There are stories that fade with time, softened by distance, blurred by disbelief. And then there are the ones that refuse to die. Those that cling like mist to the edges of reason, waiting for the next person who dares to listen. The story of the Hollow Creek Airbnb became one of those. No one spoke of it publicly anymore, but silence does not mean forgetting. Silence in that place was the problem all along. Months after the investigation ended, the forest began to swallow the cabin again. The road leading up the mountain cracked under frost, trees leaned in, reclaiming the path. It was as if the earth itself wanted to erase the evidence that anyone had ever built there. Still, sometimes hikers found signs that it remained. A flicker of light seen between the trees on a moonless night. A faint smell of wood smoke where no fire should have been. A door-shaped shadow standing upright in the fog, detached from any structure. The town below moved on in name only. People still crossed themselves when the wind came from the north, carrying that strange hollow sound that made the hair rise on the back of the neck. The few who had gone near Hollow Creek after dark claimed they heard their own footsteps echoing too close behind, slightly out of sync, as if someone walked almost in step, learning how to move like them. The cabin had been marked off limits by local authorities. The property was sealed, sold, and forgotten by bureaucrats who had no patience for myths. Yet legends have a way of surviving in places where truth feels uncertain. Campfire tales began again, first as jokes among teenagers, then whispered in the same uneasy tone used for prayers. "Do not speak in the woods," they said. "Do not answer when someone calls your name from behind you." 1 year after the disappearance, a journalist named Clara visited Hollow Creek, under the pretext of writing an article about rural tourism and forgotten architecture. What she wanted, in truth, was a headline, something eerie enough to catch attention. She had read the official report, seen the photographs, and convinced herself that all supernatural talk was exaggeration. She brought with her a small recorder and a camera, both digital, both brand new. Her plan was simple: spend a few hours near the cabin, gather footage, leave before nightfall. She never crossed the porch. Her journal was found later in her car, parked near the tree line. The final entry read, "I can see the light on. Someone is home." The footage from her camera was later recovered by her brother, though the authorities never confirmed its contents. Those who saw it privately described the same unsettling pattern. The cabin door slightly open, a faint yellow glow spilling into the snow, and 2 figures visible through the window, one seated, the other standing close behind. When Clara spoke softly into her recorder, the standing figure turned, but the face was wrong, too smooth, like wax melting beneath glass. The video ended when she whispered, "Hello." Her voice echoed twice. The second time, it did not belong to her. After that, Hollow Creek was closed entirely. The government cited environmental instability and potential sinkholes, fencing the area with warning signs. But fences mean little to those drawn by curiosity. Every few months, someone online claims to have found a new listing. The photo is always the same. The cabin under a pale sky, windows glowing. Some swear the listing disappears as soon as they refresh the page, while others say they receive a confirmation email with directions that lead nowhere, to coordinates in the middle of the forest where no road exists. A popular theory online suggests that the cabin itself is spreading through the network, an echo that uses human curiosity as a vessel. Audio engineers, still fascinated by the corrupted files, discovered an irregularity buried in the white noise of the last recording. When isolated, it formed a pattern, a pulse. It matched the rhythm of a human heart. Slowed down, it resembled a voice repeating a single word: "Stay." It would be easier to dismiss if not for the coincidences that followed. 3 people who downloaded the unedited files reported identical phenomena. They claimed to wake at the same time every night, 2:43 a.m., to the faint sound of someone moving just outside their bedroom doors. None of them lived anywhere near Hollow Creek. One lived overseas. One deleted all recordings, smashed her devices, and left her home for good. The third stopped responding to messages entirely. Skeptics say the mind is suggestible, that fear spreads faster than truth. They say stories like this thrive because humans crave mystery in a world that feels increasingly explainable. Maybe they are right. But if that were true, why do people still dream of the same place they have never seen? Why do they wake with the smell of smoke in their hair, the echo of breathing in their ears? In one of the recovered letters from the host's family, found decades later in a private collection, a line stands out. "The one mistake my father made was building walls where there should have been earth." Sound should never be trapped. It needs to move or it remembers. Perhaps that is all the listener ever was. Not a ghost, not a creature, but the memory of sound itself, bound by wood and silence until someone opened the box. Perhaps the man who vanished never truly died, only became part of the echo, repeating forever in the same hollow tone. waiting for another listener to complete the pattern. When the snow melts in Hollow Creek, the cabin roof still appears from time to time, half buried, its chimney black against the pale sky. No one goes near it, yet sometimes hikers report seeing smoke rise for a moment before vanishing. It always disappears the instant they look up from their phones as though it was aware of being watched, and every now and then, someone new posts a review under an untraceable account. The wording never changes. The place was beautiful, peaceful. You can hear yourself think here. The account deletes itself within an hour. Maybe that is how the story continues, not through fear, but through invitation. Maybe the house does not hunt, it waits. Maybe all it takes to wake it again is a single moment of silence and the curiosity of someone who believes they are alone. So, if you ever book a cabin deep in the woods and the porch light is already on when you arrive, ask yourself one question before you step inside. Who turned it on? Because if the air feels a little too still, if your voice sounds different when you speak, if the silence seems to listen, then perhaps you are not a guest at all. Perhaps the house has been waiting for you.